You are used to seeing him in white marble, great and untouchable. But in this story, you will see a completely different Caesar. Not a victor, but a man cornered, forced to swim for his life in filthy water, clutching his most precious possession in his hand, and throwing the symbols of his power to his enemies for their amusement. We will tell you how, for the sake of a tactical maneuver, the wisdom of ages was destroyed and the great library was burned. You will learn the single word that can tame thousands of enraged killers, and what happens when those killers spiral out of control, turning a battlefield into a true meat grinder where a general's orders no longer mean anything. Shocking details await you about how Roman legions built walls from the heads of their enemies, and why Caesar's mercy proved deadlier to him than any poison. Watch this until the end to understand how the Republic actually died, why betrayal came from the most unexpected quarter, and how the most powerful empire in history was born on the ashes of civil war and 23 knife wounds. The salty wind from the Mediterranean Sea brought no coolness. It only carried the nauseating smell of rotting algae and anxiety across the deck. When Julius Caesar's galley fleet cut through the murky waters of the Alexandria harbor, the air seemed to vibrate with tension, like the moment before a storm that never breaks into rain, but strikes immediately with lightning. It was the year 48 BC. The man standing on the bow of the flagship was committing perhaps the strangest tactical error of his life. Behind him were only 2 incomplete legions, 3,200 infantrymen and 800 cavalrymen. A paltry handful against a vast metropolis. Why did the greatest tactician of the era enter the lion's den carrying only a pocket knife? It was not a miscalculation. It was a psychological anomaly bordering on megalomania. Caesar genuinely believed that his name weighed more than 10,000 swords. He was wrong. Alexandria did not welcome him as a liberator that day. It watched. Hundreds of thousands of eyes stared from white rooftops, from marble embankments, from the narrow alleys of the port district. The great city, the pearl of the Hellenistic world, held its breath. Caesar had not arrived as a tourist. He was chasing his greatest nightmare and chief rival, Gnaeus Pompey the Great. The civil war that had torn the Roman Republic in half was supposed to end here, on the sands of Egypt. Caesar expected negotiations, perhaps a final battle or an honorable surrender. But the rules of war the Romans were used to, rules where even hatred had a code of honor, did not apply here. A modest Egyptian boat approached the side of the Roman trireme. No royal barges, no gold. Representatives of King Ptolemy XIII boarded. They held no weapons, only a strange object wrapped in cloth. One of the Egyptians, Theodotus, a man with the eyes of an orator and the soul of a butcher, pulled back the cover. Caesar's world reeled. Before him lay the head of Pompey. The skin, already beginning to yellow under the merciless African sun, resembled old parchment. Eyes that had once issued orders to legions from Spain to Asia now stared into nowhere with a blank, glassy gaze. This was not just the corpse of an enemy. It was a message. The barbarians, as the Romans arrogantly called the Egyptians, had decided to intervene in the dispute of 2 giants and end it with a stab in the back. They thought to buy the victor's favor by serving him his rival's death like dessert at a feast. As Plutarch wrote, Caesar turned away, shuddering with disgust as if from a murderer. He wept. Were these tears genuine? Or was it a performance for the public? The cold calculation of a politician who needed to show he mourned the fall of the Republic? Historians argue to this day. But one thing is obvious. In that moment, Caesar realized he had stepped onto territory where his status as consul and dictator meant absolutely nothing. The Egyptians had killed Pompey the Great like a stray dog. What would stop them from doing the same to Caesar? Instead of turning his ships around and putting out to sea to save his life, he took a step forward. This was Caesar in a nutshell. When the trap snaps shut, he doesn't try to pull his leg out. He tries to break the mechanism itself. He went ashore. Before him walked the lictors carrying fasces, bundles of rods with axes, the sacred symbols of supreme Roman authority. In Rome, the crowd would part in reverent awe at the sight of fasces. In Alexandria, this gesture was taken as a spit in the face. For the proud residents of Egypt's capital, the fasces meant one thing. This Roman considered himself their king. He was not a guest. He was the master. And the city exploded. This was not the organized resistance of an army. It was an elemental riot. A crowd, fueled by priests and royal advisors, flooded the streets. Roman soldiers were grabbed and killed right in the alleyways. Stones flew at legionaries accustomed to proper front lines, not dirty urban guerrilla warfare. Caesar found himself trapped. He occupied the palace complex on the Lycius promontory, but it was a gilded cage. Imagine the situation. The man who had just conquered Gaul and brought half the world to its knees was now forced to barricade doors to prevent the mob from tearing him apart. 4,000 Romans against the population of a city of 500,000 and a professional Egyptian army of 20,000 that was already converging on Alexandria. The heat was becoming unbearable. The palace walls heated up, turning the shelter into an oven. The air was thick and humid, saturated with the smells of spices, sweat, and imminent death. The Romans were cut off from fresh water sources, cut off from the sea, cut off from reinforcements. Every night could be their last. Suetonius leaves us with a sense of this paranoid fear in his texts. The great commander does not sleep. He checks the posts. He listens to the hum of the hostile city, which sounds like the roar of an approaching tide. The Alexandrians acted quickly and brutally. They didn't just blockade the quarter. They began erecting barricades, turning every street into a fortress. Achillas, the commander of the Egyptian army, understood. If Caesar was given room to maneuver, he would win. Caesar's genius was speed and onslaught. Deprive him of movement, and he is a corpse. The Egyptians locked the Roman eagle in a cramped cage where it could not spread its wings. The situation was aggravated by the fact that Caesar had brought with him not only swords, but also debts. He demanded Egypt repay old loans granted by Cleopatra's father, 10 million denarii. In conditions where people want to kill you, demanding money is either suicide or the highest form of arrogance. Pothinus, the eunuch and regent for the young King Ptolemy, openly mocked the Romans. Soldiers were given stale bread and told they should be grateful even for that, as they were eating food that wasn't theirs. Caesar saw the morale of his veterans melting away. These men had walked with him through the hell of Gallic forests and civil war. But here, in the labyrinth of a foreign city, they felt helpless. They were used to seeing the enemy's face in an open field. But here, death waited around every corner. A brick or a dart could fly from every roof. The psychological pressure was colossal. A legionary of the 10th Legion knew how to kill a barbarian with a sword. But he did not know how to fight a whole city that hated him simply for the fact of his existence. During these days, Caesar spent time not only over maps. He was playing a dangerous game of thrones. He held the young King Ptolemy, effectively a hostage. But this trump card weakened by the hour as Achilles' army tightened the ring of the blockade. And somewhere out there in the desert, the king's exiled sister, Cleopatra, was making her way to the city. But for now, she was just a ghost, a myth, a hope.
Reality was the screams of the crowd under the palace walls demanding the Romans' head. This was no longer a war for power. It was a war for survival. Caesar, accustomed to dictating his will to nations, found himself in the role of a defendant who had already been sentenced to death, but hadn't been told the date of execution. Every sunrise was met with relief. Every sunset brought terror.
The feeling of claustrophobia grew. The most powerful man in Rome was trapped like a rat in a barn about to be set on fire. And while a semblance of order was still maintained in the palace throne room, in the port of Alexandria, the Egyptian fleet was already preparing to cut the last artery connecting Caesar to life: access to the sea. The trap had slammed shut, and steel teeth dug into flesh. While Alexandria turned into a scorching hive and barricades were being built in the streets, a catastrophe was brewing in the port, capable of burying Roman ambitions at the bottom of the Mediterranean. The Egyptian squadron stationed in the harbor was preparing to attack. 72 ships, 50 triremes and quadriremes, 22 support vessels. If this fleet put out to sea and blockaded the harbor, Caesar would be completely isolated, cut off from supplies and hope. He had no time for complex maneuvers. He had only the instinct of a killer backed into a corner. The decision he made would make any keeper of history shudder. But Caesar was not a librarian. He was a general, saving his own skin. The order was short: burn everything. Roman torchbearers acted quickly. Pitch, tow, fire. The flames greedily attacked the dry wood of the Egyptian galleys. Fire is an element impossible to control when a strong wind blows from the sea. Tongues of flame devouring the rigging jumped to the port docks, to warehouses of grain and papyrus. And here, history takes its most cynical turn. Fire does not distinguish between destroying warships or the priceless heritage of humanity. The flames licked the walls of the great library. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the wisdom of centuries, the works of Aristotle, and the lost tragedies of Aeschylus turned to ash under the crackle of burning ship planking. The smoke of burnt knowledge mixed with the smoke of war. Caesar looked at this glow not as a cultural tragedy, but as a tactical necessity. A commander's conscience is clear if his army is alive. That night, Alexandria lost its memory, but Caesar bought time. However, fire was only the first of the troubles. Soon came thirst. Ganymede, the eunuch who took command of the Egyptian army after Achilles, proved to be a sophisticated opponent. He realized that Romans didn't necessarily have to be killed in battle. They could be dried out. Alexandria stood on canals, but drinking water came into the city through a complex system of underground aqueducts and reservoirs. Ganymede ordered the sluices leading to the Roman-occupied quarter closed, and giant wheels used to pump seawater into the pipes. At first, the soldiers didn't believe it. The water in the jugs turned brackish. Within an hour, it was impossible to drink. Panic spread faster than the plague. Legionaries, men who feared no Gallic axes, were terrified at the prospect of dying of thirst in a golden palace. They crowded around Caesar, demanding to board the ships immediately and leave while they still had strength. It was a moment of truth. If Caesar had shown weakness, his own men would have torn him apart. But maintaining icy calm, he declared that fresh water could always be found on the seacoast if one dug deep enough. The Romans, casting aside their swords, took up shovels. They dug wells right in the beach sand, cursing their commander and the Egyptian sun. And a miracle happened, which the soldiers attributed to the divine genius of their leader, though it was simple filtration physics. Murky but fresh water seeped through at depth. Life returned to parched throats. Caesar had won again, turning panic into fanatical devotion. He gave them water like Moses in the desert, only instead of prayer, he used engineering calculation. But the defense could not last forever.
The key to the entire port was the island of Pharos and the famous lighthouse.
One of the 7 wonders of the world, a giant tower whose light was visible for dozens of miles. Whoever controlled Pharos controlled the entrance to the harbor. The island was connected to the city by a long causeway, the Heptastadion. It was here that the most dramatic and shameful scene of the entire campaign unfolded. Caesar decided to seize the causeway to control the movement of ships. The attack began successfully. Legionaries landed on the mole, pushing back the Egyptians. But the enemy knew the terrain better. Egyptian ships approached from the rear, landing troops right behind the Romans fighting on the narrow strip of stone amidst the water. A crush began. The Romans, squeezed from 2 sides, lost formation. Discipline collapsed. Soldiers, gripped by animal terror, rushed to their ships, overloading them. The boats began to capsize under the weight of armored bodies. People drowned, dragging each other to the bottom. Caesar was at the epicenter of this chaos. He tried to stop the flight, shouted, waved his arms, but fear is deaf to orders. His own boat was besieged by a crazed mob. Realizing the vessel was about to go to the bottom with him, the master of Rome made the only decision that left a chance for life. He jumped into the water. Imagine the picture. A man whose hands senators kissed. A 52-year-old man not known for robust health, floundering in the dirty, salty water of the Alexandria harbor. Arrows and stones whistled around him. Egyptians from the shore and boats shot at floating heads like ducks. Caesar swam. But he swam strangely. With one hand he paddled desperately, trying to stay afloat, while he held the other hand high above the water. In that raised hand, he clutched not a sword, not a banner, but scrolls. His commentaries. Documents that were more important to him than life.
His legacy, his justification before history.
He was ready to drown rather than let the paper describing his victories get wet. This is the quintessence of his pride. The body is mortal, glory is eternal. 200 meters swimming, under fire, with one hand. But he left something more than just his strength in that water. The heavy purple cloak of a commander, the paludamentum, the symbol of his imperatorial power, was dragging him to the bottom. To survive, Caesar tore it from his shoulders and cast it away. The current caught the precious fabric. The Egyptians fished out the cloak as the greatest trophy. Later, they would mount it on a pole and parade it through the city, mocking Roman grandeur. Caesar climbed aboard his ship, wet, shivering, coughing up salt water, half naked. In the eyes of his soldiers, he was still a hero who had miraculously escaped. But for himself, he had endured the deepest humiliation. The Roman dictator, fleeing by swimming like a naughty slave, abandoning his cloak to the enemy. That day stripped him of his aura of untouchability. He survived, yes, but the myth of the divine Caesar who always controlled the situation went to the bottom somewhere alongside the bodies of his drowned legionaries. Now, standing on the deck and wringing out his wet tunic, he understood. The games were over. No more diplomacy, only total annihilation. In his eyes, red from salt and rage, lit that same cold fire that would soon burn the Egyptian army to the ground. While the remnants of the Egyptian fleet burned out in Alexandria and Romans wrung salt water from their tunics, a dust storm was rising in the desert east of the Nile Delta. It was not the wind. It was history marching. Mithridates of Pergamon, a man of dubious origin but impeccable timing, was leading an army of mercenaries to aid Caesar.
There were Jews, Arabs, Syrians, a motley rabble united by gold and the promise of loot. The news of approaching reinforcements acted on Caesar like an injection of adrenaline. Besieged victim mode was instantly switched off. Predator mode engaged. Caesar no longer hid in the palace. He executed a bold maneuver. Loading his thinned cohorts onto ships, he moved them along the coast to link up with Mithridates. The Egyptian army, which just yesterday held the Romans by the throat, suddenly found that the fingers had loosened. The king was no longer in the cage. The king had gone hunting. The junction of the two armies happened swiftly. Now Caesar had enough swords to speak to Egypt in the only language it understood, the language of force. The Battle of the Nile was not just a fight, but a public execution. Roman legions, driven by cold fury from months of humiliation, siege, hunger, and fear, crashed into the royal army's camp. It was a slaughter. A disciplined Roman death machine against a motley eastern horde trapped between hills and a great river. The terrain worked against the Egyptians. What was supposed to be their protection, the river Nile, became their grave. The Romans stormed the fortifications with fanatical persistence. Suetonius does not describe the details of every sword stroke, but we can imagine the chaos. The crack of breaking spears, screams in foreign tongues, the smell of ripped bellies, and the omnipresent squelching mud. The Egyptian line of defense collapsed. Panic set in. Thousands of people rushed to the river hoping for salvation, but found only death there. The water in the Nile turned brown, and the crocodiles that day received a feast unseen since the times of ancient dynasties. And there, in the center of this apocalypse, we see a figure that embodies the tragicomedy of absolute power. Ptolemy XIII, the Boy King. He was only about 15 years old. He wanted to be a great ruler, the deliverer of Egypt from the Roman yoke, but turned out to be just a frightened teenager in overly expensive armor. When the Romans broke through the defense, Ptolemy, surrounded by bodyguards, rushed to the shore. There in the reeds stood boats. Salvation seemed so close. The king jumped onto the deck of one of the barges. Behind him, crazed with fear, followed his courtiers, advisors, servants. People accustomed to living at the expense of power now killed it with their weight. The boat, designed for a few, listed. Dozens of hands clung to the sides, trying to climb inside. Physics is the most democratic science. It doesn't care about titles. The overloaded vessel capsized. Ptolemy ended up in the water. Could he swim? Perhaps. But that day he was wearing gold armor, the symbol of his divine status, the sign of his greatness, a shining carapace meant to inspire awe in enemies. In the water, this metal became a death sentence. Gold is heavy. It does not save. It pulls to the bottom. The young pharaoh, a living god, drowned in the murky, silt-smelling water of the Nile, dragged into the abyss by his own luxury. No heroic death by the sword, no last words. Only air bubbles and panic-stricken thrashing in the mud. Later, when the battle died down and a heavy silence hung over the battlefield, broken only by the moans of the wounded, Roman soldiers combed the shore with nets. They were not looking for survivors, they were looking for trophies. And they found him. Ptolemy's body was pulled from the silt. The gold armor still sparkled, washed by the river current, but the boy's face was twisted in a mask of terror. They brought this trophy to Caesar. The golden carapace was removed from the corpse and sent to Alexandria. It was a cruel but effective PR move. When the city residents saw their king's armor in the hands of a Roman legionary, resistance evaporated. The god was dead. Hope had drowned. The city opened its gates. Caesar rode into Alexandria a victor. He passed through the same streets where his soldiers had recently huddled against walls, fearing a stone in the back.
Now the crowd was silent, heads bowed. But was it a triumph? There was something rotten in this victory, like the smell of Nile slime. Great Pompey killed by traitors. Young Ptolemy drowned like a kitten. The library of Alexandria burned. The price paid for restoring Roman control was monstrous. But Caesar, standing over the body of the young king, hardly reflected on morality. He looked at the gold. For him, it was just another solved problem in the equation of power. One competitor eliminated, another figure remained on the board: Cleopatra. The war was over, but the peace that followed was deceptive. The air smelled not so much of victory as of decay. The Egyptian campaign, which began with the severed head of Pompey, ended with a drowned man in gold. The circle had closed. And while the legionaries washed the blood from their swords, Caesar prepared to make perhaps the most fatal mistake. He decided to stay. Not for war, but for a woman and the rest he had never had. A most dangerous illusion for a man for whom knives were being sharpened in Rome. The silence that followed the massacre turned out to be more terrifying than the roar of battle. Any other Roman commander, having won such a crushing victory, would have immediately ordered camp to be struck. Rome, left unsupervised, was plunging into anarchy. The Senate was in panic, legions in Italy demanded payments, and Pompeians were gathering new armies in Africa and Spain. Logic screamed, "Run home, put out the fire." But Caesar did what no one expected of him. He pressed pause. The war ended in January, but the dictator did not leave Egypt in February, nor March, nor April. Instead of rushing to Rome, he went on a cruise. It sounds like madness, but it is a fact. Caesar, a man whose life was measured in seconds and forced marches, suddenly allowed time to slip through his fingers like sand in an hourglass. He boarded the giant royal barge Thalamagos, a floating palace as tall as a two-story house, decorated with cedar, gold, and ivory, and set off up the Nile. Beside him was Cleopatra. Historians have romanticized this episode for centuries, painting it as the greatest love story. Forget that. It was not a melodrama, but a cynical deal seasoned with hedonism. Cleopatra was 21, Caesar 52. She needed a Roman sword to hold on to a throne she was barely sitting on. He needed Egypt's money, and perhaps something more. A touch of absolute divine power that did not exist in Republican Rome. She showed him a world where a ruler is not just an elected official who can be sued after his term ends, but a living God whose word is a law of nature. For Caesar, this journey became a narcotic dream. 400 escort ships sailed up the great river. Roman legionaries, accustomed to hardtack and discipline, watched their commander feast under purple awnings while they roasted in iron armor under the African sun. It was a dangerous moment. Caesar's authority, forged in the mud of trenches, began to melt in the aroma of incense. The soldiers saw not a general, but an aging tourist who had lost his head over an exotic mistress. They sailed south, past pyramids and ancient temples, to where civilization ended and Ethiopia began. Caesar studied astronomy, conversed with priests, drank wine, and enjoyed peace. But this peace was deceptive. While he rested, his enemies worked. Cato the Younger and Pompey's sons were assembling a gigantic fleet. In Rome, Mark Antony, left in charge, managed the city so poorly that blood of citizens flowed in the Forum. The state was bursting at the seams, while its surgeon was sunbathing on a deck with a queen. Why did he do it? Psychologists would say it was a midlife crisis multiplied by limitless power. Caesar had been running all his life, up the career ladder, across the Alps, across the English Channel, across the Rubicon. And here, at the top of the world, he perhaps asked himself for the first time, what for? Egypt offered him an alternative. Life not for struggle, but for the enjoyment of power. It was a virus that infected his brain. He began to get used to the idea that he was above the law. The fruit of this dangerous union was a child. Cleopatra gave birth to a son. The Egyptians called him Ptolemy XV, but history remembers him by the ominous nickname Caesarion, Little Caesar. The birth of this boy was a political earthquake, the force of which had not yet reached Rome, but had already destroyed the foundation of the future. Caesar had no legitimate sons, and suddenly, an heir. But what an heir! The son of a dictator and a foreign queen. A living bomb. For Romans, who hated kings on a genetic level, Caesarion's existence was an insult. This infant became living proof that Caesar was building not a republic, but a dynasty. He created a threat senators could not ignore. It was in Caesarion's cradle that the daggers of the Ides of March began to be sharpened. When Caesar finally decided to leave, he committed another oddity. He did not turn Egypt into a Roman province. He would have annexed any other country, appointed a governor, and imposed taxes. But he left Egypt independent. Why? The official version: he feared a Roman governor in the wealthiest country in the world would become too strong and stage a rebellion. The real reason: he gave this country to Cleopatra. It was a lover's gift, paid for with the blood of Roman soldiers. He left her not just a throne, he left her 3 legions. 3 Roman legions now obeyed a foreign queen to protect her from her own people. It was unheard of. The Roman army turned into the personal god of the dictator's concubine. Caesar left Alexandria not the same man who entered it. That Caesar was a tough, calculating pragmatist, the new Caesar carried in his baggage not only trophies, but dangerous ideas about the divinity of power. The Egyptian captivity was over, but the poison of Eastern despotism had already entered his veins. He was returning to a world where not only triumphs awaited him, but also the hatred of former friends. He thought he had rested and gathered strength. In reality, he had lost momentum. And in politics, as in war, loss of momentum is death. He sailed from Alexandria, leaving behind the calm waters of the Nile and the woman who taught him to be a king. But ahead waited a storm he had created himself with his inaction. The clock of history began ticking again, and now it was counting down the time to his end. The dream was over. The luxurious bliss of the Egyptian cruise was replaced by the dust of military roads as soon as Caesar's galley touched the Syrian shore. Waking from political lethargy, he discovered that the world, while he played God on the Nile, had begun to crumble. In the east, a new predator raised its head. Pharnaces, son of that same Mithridates who had drunk Rome's blood for decades. Pharnaces decided the Republic had weakened, that its wolves had torn each other's throats out, and now Asia belonged to him. He miscalculated brutally. He thought he would meet a tired old man, exhausted by amorous pleasures, but he met a tsunami. The campaign against Pharnaces entered tactical textbooks not for brilliant maneuvers, but for speed bordering on a violation of the laws of physics. It was an ancient blitzkrieg. Caesar didn't march, he flew. Legions covered hundreds of miles, slept on the move, ate raw grain, but did not stop. When the two armies met near the city of Zela, Pharnaces committed an act worthy of a madman. He ordered an attack on the Romans up a steep hill. This contradicted all military science. Attacking uphill means giving the advantage to the enemy. But Pharnaces' audacity worked. The blow was so unexpected,
that the iron rows of legionaries wavered. A bloody crush began. In the narrow gorge, slipping on mud and their own blood, men hacked at each other with the frenzy of cornered beasts. 4 hours of continuous slaughter. The outcome was decided not by a strategist, but by a simple soldier, a veteran who planted his shield in the ground and refused to retreat. The Roman machine ground up the enemy. Farnes's army ceased to exist. It was after this battle that Caesar sent his famous report to Rome. Not a long scroll listing losses and trophies, but a tablet with 3 words. Veni, vidi, vici. Came, saw, conquered. There was more than just boasting in this phrase. It was a ringing, sharp slap in the face to the Senate, and the shadow of the late Pompey. Pompey had messed around with Mithridates for years, begging for budgets and powers. Caesar solved the problem in 5 days. He showed Rome, look how professionals work. Speed became his main weapon, his calling card. But the real enemy waited for him not in Asia. The real enemy sat in Italy and wore Roman armor. While Caesar conquered the East, his own foundation cracked. The 10th Legion, his favorites, his Ironsides. The elite of the elite, men who had marched with him through Gaul, Britain, and Pharsalus. They mutinied. They were tired. They demanded promised money, land, and, most importantly, discharge. They were camped near Rome, terrorizing the population, killing officers who tried to calm them. It was every dictator's nightmare. The dogs of war you nurtured are ready to tear their master apart. Caesar returned to Rome. The situation was critical. Antony, the master of the horse, proposed surrounding the rebels with other troops and slaughtering the ringleaders. Caesar just chuckled. He knew steel could not defeat steel. Surgery of the soul was required here. The scene on the Campus Martius is perhaps the most vivid example of absolute charisma in world history. Thousands of enraged killers, armed to the teeth, gathered on the field waiting for their commander. They buzzed like an angry hive. They prepared a list of demands and threats. Caesar walked out to them alone. No guards, no lictors, no weapons. Just a man in a toga before an army of killers. He climbed the rostrum and looked at them in silence. The noise died down. The silence became heavy, ringing. They waited for him to shout, beg, threaten. They waited for negotiations. But he simply asked in an icy tone, "What do you want?" "Discharge!" roared the crowd. "Money and discharge!" They were bluffing. They wanted him to ask them to stay, to raise their pay. They knew there was a war ahead in Africa, and Caesar couldn't manage without them. They thought they had him by the throat. Caesar nodded. "Fine," he said calmly. "I give you your discharge. You will receive everything I promised when I return in triumph after victory in Africa with other soldiers." And then he uttered one word. One single word that hit harder than a spear blow to the solar plexus. Quirites. Citizens. He did not call them comrades, comilitones, as he had always done for 10 years. He did not call them soldiers, miletes. He called them civilians. With this one word, he instantly, in 1 second, threw them out of the brotherhood. He stripped them of their identity. He told them, "You are no longer my warriors. You are just a crowd of civilians in togas. You are nobody to me. You betrayed our common cause, and now I don't need you." The effect was stunning. Hardened veterans who didn't cry from wounds began to sob. The word quirite sounded like a curse.
like a father renouncing his children. The psychological armor of the rebels shattered. They suddenly realized that without Caesar, they were just aging killers with no future. But with him, they were masters of the world. Their bluff failed. Caesar was ready to fight without them. But they couldn't live without him. The crowd fell to its knees. "No!" they shouted. "We are not Quirites. We are your soldiers. Take us back. Punish us. Decimate us. But don't drive us away." Caesar held the pause. He enjoyed the moment. He broke their will, turning rebels into fanatics ready to die for a single glance from him. He allowed himself to be persuaded. He took them back. But now it was not an army of mercenaries demanding payment. It was a cult, and he was their god. He didn't give them a single extra coin. He executed the ringleaders, yet they kissed his hands. He tamed the beast with a word. But this victory over his own was scarier than any defeat. Caesar realized the Republic was finally dead. There was no more law, no senate, no citizens. There was only him and the legions, bound by a circular pledge of blood. He restored control, but the price was high. He finally ceased to be a politician and became a pack leader. And this pack demanded new blood. Ahead lay Africa, where the last defenders of the old republic were preparing to give their final battle, not knowing that an army was marching against them whose loyalty now bordered on religious ecstasy. While the Roman cobblestones cooled from the steps of the tamed legions, the African sand was already melting under the sun, preparing to soak up rivers of new blood. Caesar moved his army across the sea to present-day Tunisia to finish off the hydra of Pompeian resistance. But what he brought with him was no longer the disciplined machine that had conquered Gaul.
It was a pack of wolves that had tasted impunity. The veterans, whom he had just humiliated with the word Quirites, and immediately returned to the ranks, burned with a desire to wash away that shame. But wash it away not with their own blood, but with others. In Africa, they faced not only old enemies, Scipio and the Numidian king Juba, but also 60 war elephants, living tanks of antiquity, capable of trampling a cohort in seconds. The Battle of Thapsus began on the 4th of April, 46 BC, and it immediately went off script. Caesar, the great conductor of war, suddenly discovered the orchestra was not watching his baton. Legionaries of the 10th Legion, seeing the enemy, did not wait for the order to attack. They signaled the trumpeters themselves. It was an unheard-of breach of subordination, bordering on mutiny right on the battlefield. A wave of infantry surged forward, ignoring tactical formations. Caesar could only shout the password of the day, "Fortune!" and rush after them, trying to lead the chaos he could not stop. The battle turned into a beating. Roman slingers showered the elephants with a hail of lead bullets, aiming for eyes and tender trunks. The crazed animals turned around and trampled their own ranks. The Pompeian line crumbled like a house of cards in the wind. The victory was complete. The enemy dropped weapons, raised hands, lowered shields, the universal language of surrender understood by all soldiers of the Mediterranean. By the laws of war and Caesar's personal policy, called clementia, mercy, the fighting should have stopped. The prisoners were supposed to become living testimony to the victor's magnanimity. But then, something terrible happened. Caesar gave the order to spare those who surrendered, but his army went deaf. Veterans, exhausted by a decade of endless wars, tired of chasing the same enemies all over the world, made their own decision. Their reasoning was simple and grim.
A living enemy today is a new war tomorrow. If we spare them now, we'll have to kill them again in a year in Spain. The logic of tired butchers defeated the emperor's order. Before Caesar's eyes, his soldiers began methodically slaughtering unarmed men. They killed those begging for mercy. They killed even their own officers who tried to stop them, calling them defenders of the enemy. 10,000 Pompeians were slaughtered that day. Roman losses totaled only 50 men. It was not a battle. It was the industrial disposal of people. Caesar stood amidst this bloody madness, and for the first time in many years, he was powerless. The man who could quell a riot on the Campus Martius with one word could not stop a massacre in the African desert. He had become a hostage to the monster he created. His power rested on violence, and now violence dictated terms to him.
However, the real tragedy played out not on the battlefield, but within the walls of the city of Utica, a few miles from the slaughter.
There was Marcus Porcius Cato, Cato the Younger, the conscience of the Republic, a man of rock who all his life wore a black toga in mourning for dying freedom and walked barefoot, imitating ancient heroes. He hated Caesar not for personal grievances, but as an idea. For Cato, Caesar was a tyrant, even if he was a kind tyrant. When news of the defeat at Thapsus reached Utica, Cato realized the war was lost. But he decided to win the battle for history. He did not run. He organized the evacuation of his supporters, gave out money, arranged ships. He saved everyone he could. And then he hosted a dinner. It was a surreal scene. While Caesar's legionaries finished off the wounded outside the city walls, Cato sat with friends at a table engaging in philosophical conversation. They discussed Stoic paradoxes.
Only the good man is free. All the wicked are slaves. Cato spoke with heat, with a gleam in his eyes. He was already not here. He read Plato's dialogue Phaedo, a book about the death of Socrates and the immortality of the soul. He reread it twice that night. When the guests dispersed and silence fell over the house, Cato lay on his bed. He noticed his sword was missing from its place. His son had hidden the weapon, fearing what his father planned. Cato flew into a rage. He struck a slave in the face so hard he injured his own hand. He shouted, demanding his sword back, demanding the return of his right to decide his own fate. "Do you think to hold me by force?" he roared. The sword was returned. He checked the point, nodded, and said, "Now I am my own master." What followed, Suetonius and Plutarch describe with a shudder. Cato didn't just want to die. He wanted to commit an act of absolute refusal. He plunged the sword into his stomach. But the hand, injured by striking the slave's face, was weak. The blow was not immediately fatal. He fell from the bed, overturning a table with calculations. At the noise, his son and a doctor rushed in. Seeing bowels protruding from the wound, the doctor tried to put them back and sew up the cut. Cato regained consciousness, and then he did what turned his death into a legend of horror and courage. Realizing they wanted to save him, wanted to force him to live by Caesar's mercy, he pushed the doctor away. He tore open the stitches with his own hands. He widened the wound, letting life out so no one could bring it back. He died not by the sword. He died by his own will. When Caesar arrived in Utica and learned what happened, he was furious. Not because an enemy died, but because the enemy stole his victory. Cato deprived Caesar of the opportunity to forgive him. "Cato, I grudge you your death, as you would have grudged me the preservation of your life," he allegedly said.
It was a defeat. Caesar could kill the body, but Cato killed the very idea of Caesar's mercy. By his suicide, he showed all of Rome. Living under Caesar's rule is a disgrace worse than a painful death. The African campaign was over. Caesar returned to Rome an absolute victor. But behind his chariot now walked an unseen shadow. The shadow of a man who tore himself apart with his hands just to avoid being a debtor to a tyrant. And this shadow was more terrifying than all the elephants of Africa. The Republic was dead, but it had a holy martyr whose name would become a banner for those already sharpening knives in the silence of Roman offices. The smell of victory at Thapsus forever mixed with the smell of shame for the massacre and fear of the ghost of Utica. While Roman salons discussed Cato's stoic death and senators learned to live with the taste of ash on their lips, the hydra of civil war grew new heads in the West. Spain. A harsh mountainous land where hatred for Caesar had taken root deeper than olive trees. The sons of Pompey, Gnaeus and Sextus, had gathered a last desperate army here. They had nothing to lose but their lives and their father's memory. They gathered everyone under their banners, survivors of Pharsalus, fugitives from Africa, local highlanders, and even slaves. 13 legions. A huge, enraged mass of cornered men. This was no longer a war of politicians, it was a blood feud. On the 17th of March, 45 BC, two armies met on the plain of Munda. This was not a chess match like the Battle of Pharsalus. It was a street brawl, only involving tens of thousands of men. The Pompeians took a favorable position on a hill. Attacking them meant marching to certain death under a hail of pila. But Caesar couldn't wait. His time was running out. He ordered an advance up the slope. And here the mechanism that had worked flawlessly for years malfunctioned. Caesar's legions, the very veterans who had gone through fire and water with him, suddenly stopped. They didn't run, no. They just froze under the shower of enemy javelins. A psychological break. Men are not steel. They have a fatigue limit. They looked up at the enemy's wall of shields, and one thought could be read in their eyes. We don't want to die today. The silence hanging over the Roman line was scarier than a battle cry. It was the sound of the end. Caesar saw centurions shouting orders, but soldiers backing away. Another minute, and a panic flight would begin, ending in slaughter. In that moment, 55 years of life, titles of dictator and conqueror of the world, vanished. All that remained was an old man who understood. If he didn't do the impossible right now, his head would be sent to Rome in a basket like Pompey's. Caesar tore the helmet from his head. He wanted them to see his face, a face distorted by rage and fear. He snatched a shield from the nearest legionary and ran. Not back to the safety of headquarters. He ran forward, alone, against an entire army. Imagine this scene. The master of the world, suffering from epilepsy, a balding man in a red cloak, running under flying spears straight into the meat grinder. He ran up to the first ranks of the enemy, while his own soldiers watched in stupor. He screamed at them, tearing his voice, drowning out the clash of iron. "Will you let me die here? Will you give your general to boys?" Javelins flew at him. One pierced the shield, another grazed his armor. He fought. He fought like a private, dodging blows, shoving with his shield, choking on dust and his own screams. It was an act of suicidal heroism. But it worked. Shame is a powerful motivator. Seeing their commander-in-chief dying alone while they stood and watched, the veterans roared.
The pack instinct kicked in.
The 10th Legion surged forward with redoubled fury to pull their leader out of hell. The battle turned into a pile of bodies. No maneuvers, no tactics, only strike, block, strike. The wheeze of the dying, grass slippery with blood. Men tore at each other's throats, gouged eyes, bit ears. The scales wavered for 8 hours. The outcome was decided by chance, or, as the Romans said, fortuna. One of Caesar's generals managed to get behind the Pompeians. Labienus, Caesar's former best friend, and now his bitterest enemy commanding Pompey's army, saw the threat and began transferring cohorts to protect the camp. But in the dust and chaos, the other soldiers mistook this maneuver for a retreat. Someone shouted, "They're running!" and the wall of shields collapsed. What followed cannot be called war. It was extermination. Caesar's army, crazed by the fear it had experienced at the start of the battle, took no prisoners. They killed everyone who came to hand. 30,000 corpses covered the field of Munda. Labienus died in battle. Gnaeus Pompey fled, but was caught and killed later. His head was brought to Caesar. Sextus Pompey vanished into the night, becoming a pirate and a future headache for the empire. When the battle ended, Caesar, covered in mud, sweat, and other men's blood, sank to the ground. He was shaking. It was not the triumph of a victor, it was the come-down of a survivor. Later, having washed up and recovered, he would tell his friends a phrase that would become the epitaph for this whole slaughter. "I have often fought for victory, but today, for the first time, I fought for my life." Munda became the point of no return. The last army of the Republic was destroyed. No one else could challenge him on the battlefield. But this victory took the last of his humanity. He returned from the battlefield not a hero, but a beast that had survived in a cage with tigers. He saw how fragile his power was, how easily it could collapse from the mood of soldiers. And this fear, born under the Spanish sun, turned into paranoia. To celebrate the victory, the legionaries made a gruesome installation. They built a palisade around their camp, not out of wood. They built it out of the severed heads of enemies, facing them toward the walls of the besieged city of Munda. This was the new Rome. A Rome built on bones and held together by terror. Caesar looked at these dead faces and perhaps understood. The war with swords was over, but the war with daggers was just beginning. He had defeated all enemies but one, his own pride, which now, unrestrained by the fear of defeat, led him straight to ruin. Rome met its master not with the smell of blood, like the field of Munda, but with the stifling scent of incense, flowers, and fear. October of 45 BC turned into an endless carnival of vanity. Caesar celebrated his quadruple triumph. For 4 days in a row, the city drank, partied, and watched the parade of looted grandeur. First came wagons with Gallic gold, then Egyptian curiosities, then Asian trophies. The crowd roared with delight as Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe, was led in chains. It was a show worthy of the master of the universe. But in this honey was a spoonful of tar that made the Romans choke on their own screams. On the day dedicated to victories in Africa and Spain, Caesar made a mistake. By tradition, one could not celebrate victory over fellow citizens in a triumph. Civil war is a tragedy, not a cause for pride. But Caesar, intoxicated by permissiveness, ordered placards and paintings displaying the deaths of his Roman enemies to be carried. The crowd saw Cato tearing out his entrails, Scipio throwing himself into the sea. Instead of applause, a deathly silence hung over the forum. People averted their eyes.
It was a violation of taboo.
Caesar forced Rome to look at his shame, at the murder of brothers, and applaud it. This was no longer a general of the Republic. This was a king, enjoying the humiliation of his subjects. It was in these months that a terrible metamorphosis occurred with Caesar. The genius who calculated logistics for 50,000 soldiers lost touch with reality. Power is radiation. If you stay near it too long without the protective suit of criticism, your brain begins to melt. Caesar began to believe in his own divinity. He no longer wanted to be just a consul. He accepted the title Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. This meant elections were cancelled forever. The Republic, that complex mechanism of checks and balances, was thrown onto the scrap heap. On coins passing through hands in the markets, his profile appeared. A living person on a coin. Previously, only gods or dead heroes were honored with this. Now, every Roman buying bread paid with Caesar's face. In temples next to Jupiter and Mars, his statue was placed with the inscription, "To the Invincible God." He was given the right to wear a purple toga and a laurel wreath everywhere and always. At first, he wore the wreath to hide his baldness, of which he was ashamed. But soon this wreath turned into a crown, and on his feet appeared high red boots. Historians shuddered. Such boots were worn by the ancient kings of Alba Longa. Caesar dressed in symbols of monarchy, shouting with his entire appearance, "I am the state." But the point of no return was not a costume, but a gesture. One day the Senate came in full force to the temple of Venus Genetrix to inform the dictator of new honors. Hundreds of the most respected men in the world, patricians whose ancestors built this city, approached him with decrees in hand. By etiquette, any Roman, even a consul, is obliged to stand when greeting the Senate. It is a sign of respect for the people of Rome, whom these men represent.
Caesar sat. He looked at the approaching senators and didn't even budge. His advisor Cornelius Balbus whispered to him, "Remember, you are Caesar. Let them worship you." And he remained sitting like an idol, like an oriental despot accepting a petition from slaves. This moment became a slap in the face to the Roman aristocracy, the ring of which was heard even in the furthest estates. That day, sitting on his golden chair, Caesar signed his own death warrant. The senators left insulted, faces white with rage. They forgave him the civil war, they forgave him the confiscations, but they could not forgive the disrespect. Pride is the only sin the elite does not forgive. In dark porticos and at closed dinners, a conspiracy began to mature. This was not a revolt of the poor or an uprising of gladiators. It was a revolt of billionaires and intellectuals. The driving force was Gaius Cassius Longinus, a bilious, thin man with an eternally dissatisfied face.
"I do not like men who eat little and sleep little," Caesar said of him, intuitively sensing danger. Cassius hated the tyrant personally, but he needed a flag, a symbol others would follow. That symbol became Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus was Caesar's favorite. Rumors circulated that he might be his illegitimate son, as Caesar had long been the lover of his mother Servilia. Brutus was a philosopher, an idealist, a man with a heavy conscience. But his surname obliged him. His ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, 500 years ago drove out the last king, Tarquin, and founded the Republic. The name Brutus meant liberator. The conspirators began a psychological attack on Marcus. Every morning he found notes on his praetor's chair. "Brutus, are you sleeping? You are not the real Brutus." On the statue of his great ancestor they wrote, "Oh, if only you were alive." They hit the sorest spot.
his vanity and sense of duty.
They convinced him that killing Caesar was not a crime, but a sacred sacrifice for freedom. Tyrannicide is the highest virtue of a Roman. Brutus broke. He agreed to lead the conspiracy. There were about 60 of them: senators, praetors, former Pompeians, and even Caesar's own friends, such as Decimus Brutus. Fear united them, fear of what Rome was turning into. They saw Caesar preparing for a new war, this time with Parthia. He planned to leave for years. If he returned a victor from there too, his power would become absolutely unreachable. Action had to be taken now. The last straw was the festival of Lupercalia in February of 44 BC. Mark Antony, Caesar's faithful watchdog, ran through the forum half-naked, whipping people with straps of goatskin, an ancient fertility rite. Suddenly, he ran up to the rostrum where Caesar sat and held out a diadem entwined with laurel. A real royal crown. The square froze. It was a test. Caesar and Antony were staging a performance to see the people's reaction. Antony tried to place the crown on the dictator's head. Scattered, clearly prepared applause from a claque rang out in the crowd. But the people were silent. Romans hated kings. Realizing the trick had failed, Caesar theatrically pushed the diadem away. "Only Jupiter is king of the Romans," he proclaimed loudly. That was when the crowd roared with delight. Caesar ordered the crown taken to the temple, but the aftertaste remained. Everyone understood. He wanted that piece of gold. He craved it. Today he refused. But what would happen tomorrow? The conspirators realized there was no more time. They chose the date. The Ides of March, the 15th. The day the Senate was supposed to meet before Caesar's departure for war. The meeting place, the Theatre of Pompey. What irony. To kill Caesar in a house built by his enemy at the foot of his statue. The air smelled of a storm. Caesar's wife Calpurnia woke from nightmares, seeing her husband covered in blood. Soothsayers found deformed organs in sacrificial animals. A bad omen. Even nature seemed to warn the dictator. Stop. But Caesar was deaf. He disbanded his personal guard of Spanish horsemen, declaring, "It is better to die once than to live always expecting death." He wanted to show he was fearless, that he was loved by the people. This bravado cost him his life. Pride blindfolded him and led him to the steps of the Senate, where short, sharp daggers bought in the shops of ordinary gunsmiths were already hidden under the folds of snowy white togas. The golden cage slammed shut, and the keys to it were held by those he called friends. The 15th of March, 44 BC, began not with sunrise, but with a nightmare. A storm covered Rome. The wind tore tiles from roofs, temple doors flew open by themselves, and in the bedroom of the Pontifex Maximus, his wife screamed. Calpurnia dreamed the pediment of their house collapsed, and her husband lay in her arms, stabbed with knives. Morning brought no relief, only leaden heaviness. Caesar, a man who usually slept 4 hours and woke full of energy, felt shattered. His head was spinning, his body, worn out by years of campaigns and bouts of the falling sickness, refused to obey. It was that rare moment when the instinct of the beast, which had saved him in Gaul and Egypt, screamed, "Don't go." Priests performing morning divinations returned pale. The sacrificial animal had no heart. It was not just a bad sign, it was a catastrophe. In a world where superstition was part of state policy, going against such an omen was madness. Caesar hesitated. He had almost given the order to Antony to dismiss the Senate and postpone the meeting. If he had done that, world history would have taken a different course.
But fate knows how to choose couriers. Decimus Brutus entered the house.
Not Marcus, but Decimus. A friend, a comrade. A man Caesar mentioned in his will as a second heir. Decimus was part of the conspiracy. His task was to deliver the victim to the slaughter. Seeing the dictator's doubts, he played on the most sensitive string, male vanity. "What will the senators say?" he asked ironically. "That Caesar will not come because his wife had a scary dream. They will decide you are mocking them. Come, show yourself, and if you want to postpone, announce it yourself, as befits a man, instead of hiding behind a woman's skirt." It was checkmate. Pride defeated caution. Caesar put on his toga and stepped over the threshold. The path to the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was temporarily meeting, turned into a slow procession. The streets were packed with people. People reached out, begged, shouted. In this crush, a Greek teacher named Artemidorus squeezed through to Caesar. In his hands was a scroll.
Not a petition, not poems, but a detailed list of conspirators with a warning. "Read this now. It concerns you personally." Caesar took the scroll. He brought it to his eyes several times, but each time he was distracted. Someone tugged at his sleeve, someone thrust another paper at him. He entered the meeting hall clutching his own salvation in his left hand, which he never read. Another meeting took place at the entrance. Spurinna, the very soothsayer who a month ago had warned of danger on the Ides of March. Caesar, seeing him, grinned. "The Ides of March have come, and I am alive." Spurinna looked at him without smiling and replied quietly, "They have come, but they have not yet gone." Caesar entered the Curia. The senators stood in a sign of respect. It was the last honor. The conspirators acted according to plan. Trebonius, one of them, led Mark Antony aside, engaging him in empty conversation in the doorway. They knew. Antony was strong as a bull and loyal as a dog. He could break the attackers' spines with his bare hands. He had to be neutralized. Caesar was left alone. He sat in his gilded chair. A group of petitioners immediately crowded around him. These were the conspirators. They pushed the others back, creating a living ring. Lucius Tillius Cimber stepped forward, begging for the return of his exiled brother. Caesar refused. Cimber became more persistent. He grabbed the dictator's hands, supposedly kissing them. Caesar tried to stand, irritated by such intrusiveness. And then Cimber gave the signal. He jerked the toga from Caesar's shoulders, exposing his neck. "What are you waiting for? Damned Casca! Strike!" Perhaps that is what sounded in the head of the first killer. Publius Servilius Casca, standing behind, struck the first blow. His hand trembled. The blow hit the shoulder or neck shallowly. Caesar's reaction was instantaneous. He wasn't scared. He was angry. He caught Casca's hand and pierced it with his stylus, a sharp writing instrument. "Vile Casca, what are you doing?" he roared, jumping up. The power of his voice was such that Casca screamed for help. "Brother, help!" And then the dam burst. They pounced on him all at once. 23 men with knives in a tight space. It didn't look like the noble tyrannicide from paintings. It was a dirty, chaotic shanking. The conspirators got in each other's way. They shoved, slipped on the floor. Cassius slashed Brutus on the hand, missing Caesar. They struck wherever they could. Thighs, back, face, groin. The air filled with the smell of sweat, fear, and fresh blood, metallic and hot. Caesar fought back. He spun like a top, trying to dodge the blades like a cornered boar surrounded by a pack of dogs. He shouted, pushed them away, but the blows rained down. And suddenly he froze. Through the bloody veil he saw Marcus Junius Brutus.
The same Brutus he forgave everything.
The one he considered a son. Brutus was coming at him with a drawn dagger. In that moment, resistance lost its meaning. If even this man wanted him dead, then the world had truly gone mad. No theatrical et tu, Brute. In real life, when a lung is pierced by steel and your mouth fills with blood, there is no time for speeches. Caesar made a final gesture that separated him from animals. He pulled his toga over his head. He didn't want the rabble to see the pain-distorted face of the master of the world, and he pulled the hem of his garment down to cover his legs. Even dying, he thought about falling decently. 23 wounds. Only one of them, the second one, in the chest, was fatal. The rest were superficial cuts inflicted by the trembling hands of cowards who wanted to bind themselves in mutual responsibility. Caesar swayed and collapsed. The irony of history is the greatest playwright. He didn't just fall on the floor. He fell at the foot of Pompey's statue. The stone enemy looked down on him with empty marble eyes. Caesar's blood splashed onto the pedestal, flooding the feet of the one he defeated at Pharsalus, whom he chased to Egypt, whose head was brought to him in a basket. Pompey waited for his triumph after all. The victor lay at the feet of the vanquished. Silence hung in the hall, heavy, cotton-like, only the hoarse breathing of the killers and the sound of dripping blood. The conspirators stood over the corpse, clutching red knives, looking at each other with wild eyes. They expected thunderous applause, that the Senate would glorify freedom. But the Senate vanished. Hundreds of senators not involved in the conspiracy rushed to the doors in panic, knocking each other down, jumping out windows. They ran, thinking everyone was about to be slaughtered. The hall emptied. All that remained was a corpse, covered with a bloody rag, and a handful of men who suddenly realized they had no plan B.
They had killed a man, but they hadn't killed the idea. They stood in the center of an empty theater, and the echo of their footsteps sounded like a sentence. Instead of freedom, they brought chaos to Rome. And somewhere outside, on the Campus Martius, the roar of the crowd was already beginning to grow. A crowd that didn't yet know it was orphaned, but already sensed the smell of trouble. The greatest man of Rome lay dead, and the republic they tried to save died with him the very second the first knife touched his skin. The killers ran out into the street, intoxicated by adrenaline and their own righteousness. Their hands were red to the elbow, and on the point of a spear they carried a Phrygian cap, the ancient symbol of freed slaves. They shouted, "Freedom! The tyrant is dead!" They expected Rome to explode with jubilation, for the crowd to lift them up and carry them to the Capitol as heroes. But instead of ovations, silence met them.
A terrible, dense, muffled silence of a metropolis that suddenly stopped breathing. People locked shutters, merchants hid goods, mothers pressed children to themselves. Rome did not rejoice. Rome was terrified. Citizens who had lived through decades of civil wars understood what idealists like Brutus did not. The death of a dictator means not freedom, but chaos. Order, however cruel, had collapsed. The power vacuum was instantly filled with fear. The body of the master of the world lay in the empty theater for several hours. No one dared approach it. The senators had scattered. The killers barricaded themselves on the Capitol. Only toward evening did 3 faithful slaves hoist the corpse onto a litter and carry it home, across the entire city. Suetonius left us a heartbreaking detail. The litter was too short, and one of Caesar's arms, the very one that wrote laws and directed legions, hung lifelessly down, swaying in time with the bearer's steps. The fate of the Republic was decided not in the Senate, but at the funeral. On the 20th of March, Mark Antony took the rostrum. It was his finest hour. Antony was not just a soldier and a drunkard, he was a brilliant manipulator. He understood mob psychology better than Cicero's philosophy. Brutus had spoken before this, with a dry, logical speech, explaining that they killed not a man, but tyranny. The people listened politely, but coldly. Logic doesn't work when there is the smell of blood. Antony, however, appealed not to reason, but to the guts. He started quietly, listing Caesar's merits. He reminded them of the victories in Gaul, of the riches that flowed into Rome. And then he played his trump card, the will. Caesar, whom they called a tyrant, left every Roman citizen 300 sesterces, huge money for a commoner. He bequeathed his luxurious gardens across the Tiber to the city as a public park. The crowd froze. A switch flipped in people's heads. The tyrant cared about them more than the liberators. The killers didn't take an oppressor from them. They took a father and protector. And then Antony delivered the final blow. He ripped the covering from the body, but didn't show the face itself. He raised Caesar's bloodied toga on a pole. The fabric was slashed to ribbons and soaked in a brown crust. Antony poked a finger at the holes. Look! Here Cassius struck, and here Brutus plunged his knife, whom Caesar loved like a son. He turned evidence into the banner of a holy war. It was a fuse thrown into a powder keg. The crowd's grief instantly transformed into bestial rage. People, sobbing, began breaking benches, judges' chairs, money changers' tables. They piled everything wooden in the forum into a heap. They didn't need an official funeral pyre outside the city walls. They wanted to burn him here, in the heart of Rome, so this fire would scorch the consciences of the killers. The flames shot up to the heavens. The heat was so intense that the Curia itself, the Senate building, caught fire. The symbolism was monstrous. The dictator's body was burning down the house of democracy. Into this fire, veterans threw their medals, women their jewelry, musicians their instruments. It was mass hysteria, collective psychosis. From the fire was born a thirst for revenge. The mob with torches and clubs moved to find the conspirators. They didn't choose their path. The poet Helvius Cinna, a friend of Caesar, accidentally crossed their path. His only crime was his name, Cinna. That was the name of one of the conspirators. The mob didn't listen to excuses. The poet was torn to pieces right on the street, mistaken for the killer. His head was put on a pike and carried through the alleys. It was the first drop of a bloody rain that would fall on Rome for another 15 years. Brutus and Cassius fled. They thought they saved the Republic, but in reality, they signed its death warrant. By killing one wolf, they invited a whole pack of tigers into the herd. In the midst of this chaos, while Antony divided power and money, a figure stepped onto the stage whom no one took seriously. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's grandnephew, a thin, sickly youth of 18 with eyes as cold as ice. He was in Apollonia when the news came. Friends advised him to hide. His mother begged him to refuse the inheritance, which was a target on his back. But this boy was made of different stuff. He didn't possess Caesar's charisma. He didn't know how to forgive. He had no passion. He had only naked, cynical calculation. He took Caesar's name. He came to Italy and demanded his inheritance. Mark Antony laughed at him, calling him a boy. Cicero thought he could control him like a puppet. They were all wrong. Octavian is Caesar minus mercy. This is Caesar with the heart removed, leaving only the brain. He uses his adoptive father's name like a battering ram. He will form an alliance with Antony to destroy the killers, and then destroy Antony himself. He will flood Rome with the blood of proscriptions, slaughtering thousands of malcontents, including Cicero himself.
He will do what Julius lacked the spirit or cruelty for. He will kill the Republic, finally, methodically, and forever. On the ashes left from the funeral pyre in the Forum, the Empire will grow. A cold, marble, bureaucratized machine where the word freedom becomes merely a pretty term in the speeches of court poets. The story of Julius Caesar ended not with 23 knife blows. It ended with the birth of Octavian Augustus. A paradox worth weeping over. Men in togas killed a dictator to restore freedom, but with their daggers, they only cleared the throne for a real emperor. They wanted to stop time, but only accelerated its run. Was the greatness of Rome worth drowning it in the blood of its best citizens? Was the dream of order worth turning a people into subjects? Caesar will not answer. He is silent, looking at us with the empty sockets of marble statues. But history itself gives the answer. Any power that knows no boundaries, sooner or later devours its creators. And when the smoke over the Forum cleared, one thing became clear. The Republic is no more. There is only Caesar. Eternal, omnipresent, dead and alive at the same time. A shadow from which we have not emerged to this day.